So we have this idea of labor supply, labor demand. It really all does work the same way as we did with supply and demand. As long as we're talking about a competitive labor market, which we aren't always, we'll get to that later. But if we are talking about competitive labor market, then all the intuition that we have, more or less, about the supply and demand model is going to apply here. All the same things are going to happen. We can think about this demand and supply shifts in almost the exact same way. We'll talk about the ways in which they're different in a second. But we already know how supply shifts. When something shifts about how much you want to provide something, well, then it's going to shift labor supply, right? If something shifts about how much you want to buy something, that's going to shift labor demand, and both of those things will affect the equilibrium wage in the way that you'd expect that we covered before, right? You can just map those exact same leftward and rightward shifts, and there's nothing different. It just brings back all those memories of supply and demand. So it's mostly the same. Let's talk about some of the ways in which the labor supply and labor demand might be different from what we learned about more general. So first of all, labor supply. What determines labor supply? So labor supply is a production decision. What are you producing? Well, you are producing your time and effort. What is it that takes you to give up your time and use your effort providing to your job, right? So anything that affects your ability to do that is going to affect your labor supply. So just like our production decision, we have to think about the opportunity cost of working. What else could you be doing with your time other than working? It's going to affect your labor supply. And what this really comes down to at the heart of labor supply is the trade-off between what economists sort of derive, like this is not, these are not the greatest terms, but market work and leisure. And leisure is a very broad term that does not mean what you think it means. Leisure means literally anything that you're doing with your time that is not market work, which is not a great term. But we haven't gotten around to changing it yet. And this includes all sorts of things, right? This includes sleep, it includes actual leisure, like if you're having fun or whatever, but it also includes like chores, taking care of your kids, right? If you are a homemaker, then by this definition, you spend pretty much all of your time in leisure, right? Which is not really accurate. Anything that's not market work, right? So that's the trade-off that we're considering. Anything that's going to affect this trade-off, anything that makes leisure more attractive is going to make you want to provide less market work. Anything that makes leisure less attractive is going to make you want to provide more market work. And that's outside of changes in the wage. And this is all working through the exact same marginal benefit equals marginal cost, marginal decisions that we were talking about before. In fact, we've used labor examples before. Remember that homework example or that homework or worksheet question where it was, okay, here's your margin, here's how much you get paid per hour. Here's how much you value time with your family. How much should you work at this given wage, right? That was a labor supply question. It was asking for a given wage, how much labor do you want to provide? And that's exactly what's going on here. We're making the exact same marginal benefit equals marginal cost decisions as other kinds of producers. In this case, our marginal benefit is basically the wage. It's whatever we get paid for our time and effort. In this class, we'll generally discuss this as though it's like an hourly wage. It does, I mean, salaried workers, the exact math doesn't work out, but it's the same sort of idea. And it's just simpler to not think about it. And the same sort of results mostly come out. So that's marginal benefit is whatever you get paid for your time and effort. Marginal cost is determined by the leisure or home production that must be given up to work instead. What are you giving up to spend time at work instead of being at home? So what drives this? I mean, part of it is we like being able to buy things with the money that we earn. That is definitely a component of this, right? But we don't like having to give up our free time to earn that money. We would rather not have to go to work, or at least work less, probably. Yeah. And there could be other things in there, right? You know, you could get some sort of intrinsic enjoyment out of your job. I certainly do. But for simplicity, we're going to focus on the wage thing, the benefit of going to work. And we'll talk about other things next time as well. So we have this fundamental trade-off. We're deciding how to spend our time as individuals. So we can ask ourselves, what are some things that are going to cause labor supply to shift in and out? Whatever makes you want to work more is going to shift the curve to the right. Whatever makes you want to work less is going to shift the curve to the left. Right? So some things that are going to change it. So I'll cover the first one, which is outside of that basic time trade-off, which is just changes in population. Right? As a competitor, just like with the number of producers that we talked about with supply and demand curves, as you get more people in, that is an increase in your labor supply, right? Labor supply curve is made up of many individual labor supply curves. right? Each individual person adding up their work all together to get to a market labor supply curve. The more people you have, the more labor supply you have. Pretty much as simple as that. Which is one element of what's going on right now. One reason why wages are going up so high is that labor supply is down for a couple of reasons. One, a lot of people died, which is not great. It has shifted labor supply to the left. We also have seen a huge reduction in the number of immigrants that we've had. It's dropped by about half since something like 5 years ago, which is a not fewer people who are available to be in the labor market. There's also people who are staying out of the labor market because they don't want to catch COVID. Right, that is another reduction in the number of people who are available to provide their labor, who might not be willing to work at any wage or able to work at any wage, and so that is a reduction in labor supply. Which, as we know, when supply shifts to the left, what happens to the price/wage goes up, which is what we're seeing right now. So as we add more people, labor supply curve shifts out to the right. I did expect. There's actually a big debate in terms of how immigration plays into this as well, right? Because when people immigrate into an area, they bring labor supply, but they also bring a lot of demand. They buy stuff too, right? When they move somewhere. And so there's always a question of what is the effect of immigration on people who already live there? One of the effects is that you expect this increase in labor supply, which should drive wages down, but also they buy a bunch of stuff, which drives up demand, which should bring prices back up. Which of those two effects wins out is going to depend on which native population you're talking about, also in what context and in what time. The effects generally tend to balance out what they tend to find, or at least maybe a little bit positive. It varies depending on your location and when you're talking about. So another example of this is happening in World War II, when labor supply had a huge shift due to the number of producers. Similarly, in a lot of other large-scale wars, World War II, most people going off to the war in the United States were men. And there were also most of the labor force at the time. So it's made it very difficult to find male workers at home, which means that labor supply shifted in, wages went up by quite a bit. So what happened as a result? Wages came up, and this had an interesting result. What happened? What do we say what's going to happen over here as wages go up? Well, some people who are out of the labor force are going to join the labor force as they realize that wages are higher. This was a time in which women entered the labor force in huge quantities, partially because the wages had gone up. And people who used to be homemakers and probably had planned to be homemakers their whole lives said, "Hey, wait a minute. A, I need some money. My husband's not home. And B, now the wages are much higher. I can get a lot more money than I would have before. Maybe it's worth it for me to go into the labor market." And also, they were relaxing sort of norms around who was allowed to work in the market at the time and in what jobs. So a lot of stuff going on there, but that was one of the elements happening. Next, changes in wealth. And this is something that can change labor supply as well, which one that happens to also be pretty relevant right now. So we're talking about a trade-off between labor and leisure, right? And leisure being everything that's not your market work. So why would you want to choose market work? Well, because you get paid and you get to consume things in your non-work time that you might not be able to otherwise, right? I need to afford my rent. I can get a nicer place if I work more at my job. And so, I need that money. I need to trade off how much time I'm spending at my job with my ability to pay for this nice place that I live in, right? So what if you just had a bunch of money sitting around? If you have a bunch of money sitting around, well, then you don't need to do as much market work to get the same amount of consumption that you would otherwise, right? So when a group of workers experience a general rise in the wealth that they have, the marginal benefit of additional income drops. You're not as willing to work as much, which means that labor supply is going to shift. Now, I want to be clear, this is not a change in the wage. This is not saying, hey, I've got a raise at work, I don't need to work as much. That is also an effect, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about just getting some money that you now have, and that you can potentially just sort of spend on your bank account to support yourself. So this would lead to a labor supply shift, right? If people get wealthier in general, labor supply should shift left because they will not need to work as much to maintain their consumption. If people lose a bunch of money, then labor supply should shift to the right because people now need to work more to support their incomes. This comes about in a bunch of different ways. One of the ways that we see it happening this year is with relief checks. We send out a bunch of relief checks to a bunch of people, and people's wealth went up. For a lot of people, they have a considerable, in percentage terms at least, a lot more in terms of wealth than they had at the beginning of the pandemic. So like I mentioned before, it's very unusual for a recession. And people debate a lot about how much of an effect that has on the labor supply, but at least theoretically, we would expect that it should be shifting it to the left as people have the ability to either maintain consumption or maintain a preference for not working during a pandemic because they can fall back on these funds. And that's exactly what the funds were intended to do. So, they're doing their intended thing. Another place this can happen is when just asset values go up or down. So the major source of assets for most people, at least in the United States and a lot of other places, is the housing market. For a huge number of people, the biggest asset that they own is the place that they live. This is true even though a lot of people do not own the place where they live. It's just one of the biggest assets. So what happens when the value of homes goes up? Well, everyone who owns a home just got richer, right? Their wealth has gone up. Imagine, say, for example, that you are saying, okay, well, I bought this house, I'm going to invest in it for 30 years, and then I'm going to retire, and I'm going to have this house that's worth a lot of money, and that's going to be part of what I'm going to use to retire, right? Well, if the price of your house goes up, well, then suddenly you don't need to work as much to get to your retirement account, right? Which means that you can work less. So as the asset values go up, you would expect people to be able to work less because they now have wealth. They do not need to work as much. One study on this finds that a 10% increase in housing prices decreases labor market participation by about 0.6%. Which also plays into a couple of things that's happening right now. One, housing prices have just absolutely gone up like nuts. So everyone who already owns a house just got way richer this past year. And so they don't need to work as much because now their house is worth a huge amount of money. Granted, they might have to think about how they would ever get access to that money if house prices stay up because they need to live somewhere. But they're out there, their values have gone up. Also, asset prices in general have gone up. The stock market has gone up quite a lot. Anybody who owns stocks just got a lot richer. You happen to be a cryptocurrency person, you've just gotten a lot richer as well, right? Asset values are going way up. Wealth has gone way up, which means people don't need to work as much to cover their consumption, which we would expect should shift labor supply inwards. So we have a lot of, basically everything that I've been describing so far is pushing labor supply to the left. And what do we see? We see really high wages right now. Any questions on wealth changes? Changes in the value of time. Now this one, the last one dealt with that time work trade-off. This one's really about it. So anything that changes the value of your time outside of work is going to change how much you're willing to work. If your time outside of work is super valuable, then you are going to want to work less. So it's because you're being asked to give up more because your time is more valuable than it used to be. So anything that makes non-market work worth less of your time should increase your labor supply and vice versa. If you got nothing else to do, you might as well work. At least you get paid. If you got a lot of other stuff to do, you're going to want to cut out early and work fewer hours. So kids are a good example of this. You have kids, suddenly the value of your time outside work has just gotten a lot more valuable. A, because you want to spend time with your kids. B, because you have to take care of your kids, right? So the value of what you're doing outside of work has just gone up. You should want less labor supply at a given wage. As entertainment gets better, we just have other things to do with our lives. There are more things pulling us from work. Expectations for childcare have gotten more intense as well, right? If you're a parent, you are expected to spend a lot more time with your kids than would have been the case 50 or 60 years ago. Childcare is just better now. More is expected of parents. You do more for your kids than would have been expected. This is a higher pull on your time from outside of work, right? Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just means that you're shifting away from that work time towards what economists would call the leisure time, which is less labor supply. So changes in value of time was one component of the biggest labor market shift in the past century. I mentioned women coming into the labor force during World War II, and that was definitely one inciting factor of women going into the labor force, right? It did not used to be the case 100 years ago. It would be kind of surprising if a woman said, yeah, I'm planning to have a career, and now it is not surprising in the least, right? So there was a shift there. There were lots of social changes going on, right? Lots of political movements and et cetera. But one of the things that helped was the invention of labor-saving devices in the household. There's a lot of really good evidence that the timing of the introduction of things like, vacuum cleaners or dishwashers were one thing that reduced the need outside of work for time to do those sorts of chores. We've made it much easier to have a household where both members work. Right? You can imagine a world in which we had all these same political movements, but we didn't have labor-saving devices. We probably would end up in a world where we would still expect one person in the household to work and one not to work, but maybe the gender mix would be more equal. Right? That's not the world we live in. We live in a world where generally you expect both members of the household to work, and that is almost certainly because of labor-saving household devices.